Howdy, name's Rainfall. You know, I've been sitting here for about 4 hours trying my darndest to record a video about the Bible and about God and about Christianity. 3 things that I know a good bit about. I grew up in a Christian church. I've studied the Bible for close to 15 years hardcore. I've read it about a dozen times from Genesis to Revelation over a period of many years. And I feel like I'm not a religious scholar by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm a religious scholar, but I am going to say that I know the Bible pretty well. And I kind of can gather a little bit of information from it and glean a little bit of intel about God and about the church and about Christianity because I have a mind and because I have a pair of eyes and because I have logic. Now, with that being said, I have been trying my best to record a reverent video on the concept because I don't want people to get the concept, the idea, the misconception that I am in any way exalting myself above the person viewing. I am not trying to tell you how to believe. I'm not trying to tell you how to think. I am not going to sit here and tell you that I have the answers and that I am somebody to be listened to and regarded with any value whatsoever. But it is really hard to be respectful about a topic that I myself have difficulty respecting. The Bible is a very good book, but it is a terrifying book if you really get into it, into certain aspects of it. And I'm going to try and talk about that a little bit because I kind of want to give the millennial perspective of why the Bible is so weird, as well as why the church is not a place that I want to spend any of my time. First thing I'm going to say is that I believe the Bible has 2 rules, which is the title of this video. The Bible only has 2 rules. The Bible has a lot of commandments, and I mean, it has the entire book of Proverbs, and it has all of the teachings on the meaninglessness of life in Ecclesiastes. It has all of the teachings of Christ. It has the book of Revelation. It has a lot of stuff in it. And that saying that the Bible has 2 rules will make any Christian scratch their heads a little bit because they're like, well, I don't know, you look at this verse and you look at that verse and you look at this entire compendium of verses which cannot fit onto a single page that is of any length less than half a mile. Yeah, you're probably wrong about that, Rain. All right, well, let me explain myself because I definitely believe that I'm correct about this, but also kind of not. And give me a second, I'll tell you about it. All right, the rules that I believe the Bible sets forth are twofold: love God and love others. That's it. I believe that every verse, with certain very critical exceptions, falls under that umbrella of loving God and loving others. You look at the 10 Commandments, for example. The first commandment is have no other gods before me. That obviously falls under the love God category. Do not kill and do not steal and don't bear false witness against thy neighbor and honor thy father and mother. Those obviously fall under the love others category. It's very common sense stuff. Like, you don't want everybody killing each other because if you kill everybody, then everybody will be dead. You know, like, we'll kind of go extinct if everybody's dead. You don't want everybody stealing from each other because then they'll start killing each other to be able to have things and then everybody's dead. It's obvious. And that's something that a lot of the rules in the Bible fall under. Charity, for example. Charity is something that the Bible pushes pretty hard and something that I believe the church misrepresents pretty hard by making it seem like it's a requirement and you're sinning against God if you're not giving, according to the Southern Baptist Convention, 10% of your income. But charity is extremely vital to the teachings of the Bible, telling you to be generous and give to people who are obviously in need of things, and you are comfortably able to give, then give, because that's just the nice thing to do. That is loving others. I reference the Southern Baptist Convention because the concept of tithing is something that is pushed very heavily, at least in Baptist churches. I can only speak from the perspective of a Baptist because that is the kind of church that I grew up in. We never touched the Lutheran church or the Methodist church or the Catholic church when I was growing up because those are heretical. They don't teach the Bible, which is funny because the Baptist congregation also kind of twist the Bible up a little bit. And the example that I'll give is, again, tithing. As soon as I turn in my notes to the page that talks about tithing, give me a second, Leviticus 27:30 is used to try to justify tithing. Leviticus 27:30 refers to bringing God fruits, and later it talks about bringing animals. You look into the context, it's talking about burnt sacrifices, which is a thing that used to be extremely important in the early days in the Old Testament because burnt sacrifices were something that was needed to satisfy the wages of sin is death rule. And that's something that mercifully is not a thing anymore because of Jesus jumping on the scene and being the final sacrifice and yada yada. That is not something I'm going to talk about very extensively in this video, because if you really want to hear about Jesus dying and rising again, as I'm sure most anybody that watches this video ever will have heard at some point, read the Bible, for goodness sake. Don't go to a church. Don't listen to those guys. Read it for yourself, then go to a church if you decide to. I'm going to justify that statement in a bit. Malachi 3:10 refers to putting meat in God's storehouse so that there may be meat on God's table, which is kind of odd considering God is a celestial being and probably doesn't eat, not by necessity anyways. So ultimately that verse is just talking about being charitable, and that's something that people need to do. It's not telling you that you need to give no less than 10%. If you give 9%, oh my goodness, you're sinning. It's talking about giving giving something, giving anything. If you can comfortably give, then give. Be generous. Be a good neighbor. That's something that is just common sense and is necessary for a society to function. Ebenezer Scrooge is populating our society is definitely going to lead to a collapse and anarchy and killing each other and yada yada. But the 10% thing is completely made up. It is made up by the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845, where they decided that they would start telling people to give 10% of their income. And if you think about it from the perspective of the church, it makes sense, because in case you hadn't noticed, preachers and bishops and priests and all those sorts of people typically don't have real jobs. They're effectively just Twitch streamers, but the religious variety. And one thing that I could say is a difference between a Twitch streamer and a preacher is that while Twitch streamers get income by handouts, by people handing them money in exchange for absolutely nothing, streamers don't tell people that they're sinning against God if they don't give them money, as opposed to a pastor who passes around the offering plate and waggles his finger in people's faces and counts it up, making sure it's 10%. Charity by force is not charity, it's slavery. And that's kind of a big problem with tithing and with requiring that people give a minimum of 10%. In today's world, 10% can break the bank for a lot of people, for a lot of families with income that is not able to support the 10% concept. You cannot just require a flat amount and say it's in the Bible whenever it's not. That's something that is absolutely, in my opinion, blasphemous, because you're adding to the Bible something that's not there. And while we're on the subject of ascribing a importance to something that has no importance, let's talk about profanity. This is the point where if you're easily offended, or if you are a Christian who doesn't want to have a snare thrown upon you, then go away, because I don't want to, I'm not here to piss you off, although I know it's going to happen. And I know that this video will probably be the most disliked video on my channel. If it gets any views at all, it'll probably be disliked so much and rage commented so much by the Christian zealots that view this video that it'll never enter the algorithm again. But if you'll humor me, I'll tell you for just a second. Swearing in the Bible refers to making a blood oath, refers to making a promise. And because of how strong swearing was in the Bible, how extremely important it was whenever you swore by your mama's grave or something like that, that was critical that somebody follow through on a promise that was made with such strength and with such extreme importance placed upon it. Because while nowadays everybody makes the yo mama jokes, back in the olden days you'd be killed in a heartbeat if you said something about somebody's mama, and saying something about your own mama would probably get you killed by everybody else because you're disrespecting your mother, who is considered to be a sacred person in your family lineage. And that's making a promise. That's what swearing was in the Bible. Nobody in the Bible said fuck, in case you didn't notice. The word shit does not come up even once in the Bible. But people nowadays call those swear words, which doesn't make any sense whenever you consider that anybody that says fuck is not necessarily making a promise. Because calling fuck a swear word is like saying that this chair I'm sitting in is a freedom chair. I don't see any bald eagles sitting on it. I don't see it being painted red, white, and blue, and there's no F-22 Raptors parked on top of it, so you can't just throw a word onto it and say that this is a freedom chair. Just like you can't throw swear onto the word fuck and say that it's a swear word and is therefore against the Bible. The Bible talks about keeping your communication pure. Again, that's referring to don't lie, because God, in case you didn't notice, fucking hates lying. He refers to that over and over and over again in the Bible, that he hates dishonesty because it was Satan's second sin after the sin of pride, thinking that he could be better than God. He then goes and lies to Eve that eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was going to make her a god. That was a lie. God obviously would hate lying a little bit. So there's that. Swearing is not the same as swearing in the Bible, because you can't just put evil onto a word and now it's evil. It doesn't work that way. It should be patently obvious. I can't just say that you can't sit down. Duh. All right, let's stave off the inevitable conflict a little bit by talking about eating pork, bugs, crustaceans, and that sort of thing. That's a rule that was nullified whenever Jesus was around. Matter of fact, that happened to the Apostle Peter. Whenever Peter was sitting in his house and minding his own beeswax, when all of a sudden, here comes God with a big old white sheet, and he unfolds that thing in front of Peter and says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter looks at it and says, "What the heck is all this shenanigans going on around here? Why are you showing me all this stuff telling me to eat? These are foods that you specifically told our ancestors that we can't eat. Why are you throwing this in my face?" And God said, "What I have cleansed, call not thou unclean." And then he folded the sheet up and threw it over his shoulder and toted it off until Peter was not expecting him to come back. And then here he comes with a white sheet again saying, "Rise, Peter." That is in Acts 10, in case you would like the non-paraphrased and non-humorous version of that story. This is where God kind of does a 180. And for somebody who was told over and over again in church that God doesn't change, God is an unchanging entity who never changes his mind, he's always going to be the same, always has been the same, always will be the same. But the Bible specifically refers to something, an instance where he said, "You know that thing that I said, never mind about that." And that was for a little bit a kind of a odd thing for me to read until I really actually applied my brain to it and realized what's going on. Later on in Acts 10, he talks about Peter going to meet with some guys who showed up at his house, and he was telling them about how God had told him in a vision that he did not consider the Gentiles, i.e. anybody who wasn't a Jew, that to not be unclean anymore. That, you know, they're just some of the guys now. They're the bros. They're the peeps. God's cool with people who aren't Jews, because God before Jesus was a tribal God who was only concerned about the Israelites and damned be everybody else. Jesus jumped up on the scene and now everybody's cool. And that's pretty important for a person like me who is technically a Gentile. You know, that's awesome. But it doesn't change the fact that God was using a food metaphor, if you can even call it a metaphor, because I definitely think Peter rose and killed and ate of the pigs and the crabs and the creepy crawlies, which were on the sheet. That was an instance where God said, the rule that I had back then is no longer in effect. And that kind of makes you wonder, why was the rule there to begin with? Eating things doesn't seem to be a violation of love God, love others. Like, why me eating pork make somebody sad? You know? Well, that was because of a very practical reason. Trying to prevent a mass extinction. In the olden days, like around the time of the ancient Egyptian Empire, human population was definitely not bordering 8 billion like it is nowadays. It's impossible to discern exactly how populous Earth was back then, but rough estimates that are as best as can be ascertained, considering nobody back then ever kept censuses, lands around 150 million. Which is very small, especially whenever you consider that the bubonic plague, which hit the scene in the 1300s, killed an estimated 25 million people. 25 million is a pretty huge chunk of 150 million for a vastly infectious disease that broke out extremely later in human history than the ancient Egyptians, whenever that kind of rule was put into place, where you can't eat these foods that could probably give you a disease if they're not cooked in an extremely specific way that you don't know how to do because you don't have germ theory or any understanding whatsoever of how diseases work. Back then, they thought dirt was still clean. So why, you know, why would there be any issue with don't have people eat pork and bugs and things back then that are really hard to clean and could definitely lead to a mega disease that could mutate and wipe out all life on Earth? It shouldn't be an issue. I mean, look at COVID. Think about if COVID had broken out back then. That would have been a world killer. And a disease from eating bad pork or bad centipede or bad lobster could have done the exact same thing. So while we're on the topic of disease and health and wellness and maintaining the human species existing on this planet, let's talk about sex, because that is something that is mentioned extremely frequently in the Bible and something that is a huge point of friction for basically anybody who has genitalia. You know, sex is extremely important for a person's physical well-being as well as their mental well-being. It is a very important aspect of the human experience because it means so much to a person. It obviously has its benefits from the physical aspect of it being pretty darn awesome to experience as a person with a body, but it's also extremely important experience for somebody who has a soul, who has emotions, and who has the ability to develop a physical as well as a heart connection with somebody else. It's an important relationship for a person to have whenever you're having a relationship with somebody that is so strong that you will break down your own safeguards and make yourself extremely vulnerable to somebody else and allow them the opportunity to destroy you and then revel in the fact that they choose not to and instead do the opposite. That is a life-changing experience for anybody. It is extremely important, and it is monumentally catastrophic whenever something like that is violated by somebody deciding, fuck you and screw your feelings, I'm gonna go lay asleep with this guy here. That's why the Bible says don't commit adultery and don't commit fornication. It's not because God's throwing an unnecessary ball and chain on your ankle because fuck you. He's doing it, and he's making these commandments all throughout the Bible and putting such a heavy emphasis on the value of sex and on the value of monogamy because it is extremely important to somebody's mental well-being, to their psychological needs. You can't just go and cheat on somebody and it not cause lasting damage to the person on whom you cheated. And probably also cause damage to the person with whom you cheated because they probably know that you cheated and probably know that you're going to do it to them as well and have pretty much heartless sex. It's not something that you can just get away without having any victims. It's extremely important and has a lot of value put on it, not just by God, but by people. And so it should be patently obvious why that law exists. Besides just the obvious disease aspect of it. STDs are no joke, and diseases in the olden days, whenever the fornication and adultery laws were first mentioned, is a big fucking deal. Like, you could wipe out the population if a disease mutates wrong. So, obviously there's that. That's the practical reason behind it. But just the reason of love God, love others. It's not very loving of others to completely devalue them and toss them aside and then go and value somebody else, forgetting that person ever existed. And that's obvious. That's common sense. And so now we get into the weeds, and now we start getting a little tricky with the topic at hand. Homosexuality. I am not even going to start by talking about the Bible. I'm going to start by talking about the CDC, because I just mentioned how sex is potentially a serious disease-causing thing. According to the CDC.gov, well over 50% of all HIV infections occur between gay men having sex. That's a government website, CDC. Look it up. Gay men also, whenever they're sexually active, have a higher chance of contracting hepatitis A and hepatitis B and HPV, disease causer. In modern times, when medical technology and health advancements, sanitation advancements are obviously the highest they've ever been in human history, it's still extremely dangerous whenever you consider how horrible HIV is. And that's not even including what the Bible says about it. Leviticus 18:22 calls homosexuality an abomination, where a man sets aside the natural use of a woman and burns with lust against another man. It's basically what it says. I'm trying to remember as best as I can how it's phrased, but you get the point. God says it's an abomination. And for anybody who is gay, anybody who is lesbian, anybody who is queer, anybody who is pansexual, anybody who is questioning, anybody at all who is not straight, that's really abrasive. That's really off-putting. To be told that the way you feel about somebody is an abomination before God. I mean, what are you supposed to think whenever you're just straight up told you're abominable? Romans 1:27, of course, references gay men's higher STD risk, and there's not really a reason for me to bring that up because, I mean, the CDC brought it up. But homosexuality is extremely important in modern culture because people want to fuck who they want to fuck. And they want to be able to do it without being made to feel like they're horrible. But the Bible says no. The Bible says it's abomination, and it talks about how much higher of a risk it puts you of contracting an STD. Because again, it's there to say that these sorts of things can definitely bring about diseases. God obviously did not want people to go extinct by, spreading about a bunch of plague. And so he would obviously feel very strongly about doing something that has a dramatically high risk of creating a plague. And so that is why he spoke about it so strongly. But with that being said, what about protection? What about talking about the food thing and how God made an advancement in that over a period of time where sanitation changed and people were able to eat of food that was previously unclean? What would God say about homosexuality now whenever you consider that condoms are a thing? I mean, medical advancements, like I just said, they're higher now than they've ever been in human history. It's easier to survive bad stuff now than ever before. Would God change that? I don't... I mean, you ask any preacher and he's obviously going to say no. But you look at the Bible and look at how God changed over time with reference to the food, as well as how he changed with reference to how ritualistic the cleansing process was whenever a priest went into the Holy of Holies in the temple of the Lord, or how in the olden days the priests were supposed to try to determine whether or not a woman had committed adultery by sweeping the dust off the floor, mixing it well with water, and handing her that delightful cocktail so that she would then be compelled to drink it, and if her stomach rotted out and she died, then that means she committed adultery. Some pretty dark shit if you think about it. It's some Salem witch trial stuff. But that's a thing that's in the Bible. And thankfully, I believe that was erased again whenever Jesus was up on the scene. But that kind of stuff obviously changed over time. God obviously chilled out a little bit whenever Jesus was around. And a lot of the rules that were there for ritualistic cleansing, specifically, again, centering around burnt sacrifices and disease control and management, that sort of thing, are no longer quite as prevalent in Jesus' time. But Romans 1:27 is in the New Testament. Jesus has already been established. Jesus, at that point, has already risen and gone back up to heaven after he died and rose from the dead. And he's still calling it an abomination. So, I'm not going to say anything more about it. Because again, I'm not here to tell you how to think about it. I know how I feel about homosexuality and about loving who you decide to and having sex with whom you decide to. And I'm not going to try and influence your opinion about it. It's not my place to do that. You read the Bible, or don't. Choose what you will. I'm not going to say anything more about it. I'm just going to say that it doesn't exactly match up with how society's evolving now. But that does bring up the question, should the Bible evolve to fit society, or should the society evolve to fit the Bible? And I have an opinion about that too. All right, let's get into probably the biggest item on this list that I didn't want to talk about. 1 Corinthians 14:34. 99% of anybody that would listen to me say that verse would not know what that is. The 1% would roll their eyes and shake their heads and be sad. because 1 Corinthians 14:34 is one of the most brutal verses in the entire Bible. It is a blunt contradiction to the concept that you should just love God and love others, and those are the two rules of the Bible. It really runs afoul of a lot of how God's character is portrayed throughout the Bible, and how he, is supposed to love everybody and value everybody, and everybody's important. And then it turns around and says that women need to be silent in churches. It says women should not talk in the presence of men in a church. This is one of the points where I just kind of fall off the train, because it is really a poor tasting verse to read. The idea that women are dehumanized and devalued in this verse in the Bible, in an epistle by Paul, who comprises a lot of the Bible, a lot of the New Testament with his teachings. Like, Paul has the highest volume of real estate in the New Testament with all of his writings. There's a lot of stuff written by Paul in the Bible. And he just straight up says, y'all women shut up and sit down. Let the men talk. I mean, what the fuck? How do you consolidate that? I'll tell you how I consolidate it. A lot of people try to explain it by saying something about the context being with prophecies, and how, you're supposed to judge prophecies as you're determining whether or not a prophecy is actually from God or whether it's not legitimate at all. Prophecies are obviously something that people don't fuck with much nowadays, unless your name is, Joseph Smith or Muhammad or any of that kind of thing. They're really not relevant anymore. But in the olden days, they were a serious issue. And that's one of the justifications that a lot of people try to use for talking about women being quiet. And personally, I have a different take on it. I have a different interpretation of it, because Paul is known repeatedly throughout the New Testament and throughout his epistles to give his opinion and not give the commandment of God for whom he was speaking. There's one point at which he tells Timothy that he needs to drink a little wine for his stomach, because Timothy was trying to get over stomach illness, and Paul was advising him that he should drink some wine and not just drink water, because it'll help his stomach, provide whatever probiotics or whatever that he didn't know about at the time, but he knew that it would help. And that's not God giving a commandment. That's just Paul corresponding with his bro. So there's that, but there's also an entire chapter where Paul talks about how he wishes everybody would just stay virgins. Yeah, he said that he wishes that people would be just like he was, because Paul was a virgin, and he stayed a virgin. Take that as you will. But he said at the very beginning of this very long and very strange chapter that he was saying the stuff that he was saying and giving the preaching that he was giving under permission, not under commandment, meaning that he was acknowledging that it was just his opinion that he was saying. He wasn't telling people that's what God was saying. He just wished that everybody would do what he did and never fuck. And that is obviously blatantly just his opinion whenever, there's multiple places all throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New, where God's like, yeah, have yourself a wife, have yourself a husband, make you some babies. That's how the species stays around. So Paul is known to give his opinion on many occasions, honestly, throughout the epistles. And that's not to devalue the epistles at all. It's just kind of throws Paul into a kind of a strange light. You already know he was a virgin. He chose to be a virgin his entire life. And then he comes up and say that women should sit down and shut up. I definitely think that's just his opinion. Because God values women just as much as he does men. And that's not something that Paul very well reflected in that chapter. And like I said, people try to explain it as being something that's specific to the time period and specific to the things that the early church was going through. And while that may be true, Paul was a lifelong virgin and possibly a misogynist. Like, there's all kinds of horrible interpretations you can take away from that. So there's my interpretations of and ideas about these different rules. And now we're going to get into what I said in the very beginning of the video, which is why I don't go to church anymore and why I probably won't. I know that the Bible says at one point, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together in the name of God, for where two or more people are gathered in his name, there will he be also, or something to that effect. I know it's not phrased exactly like that, but I got it as close as I could because I couldn't find it whenever I looked earlier. I still don't go to church because there is a hostility in congregations. Obviously, everybody has this big old smile and everybody's got this warm welcome to give you whenever you come in before they hand you the offering plate and tell you to pay up or die. But there's definitely a condescension that happens with anybody that comes into a church who is not abiding by all of the same rules that everybody else is. Somebody who is free thinking, or maybe free thinking but wrong in some obvious capacity. Best example I can give is anybody who is an alcoholic who goes into a church. The Bible says wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whoso is deceived thereby is not wise. There was a guy who was in a church whenever I was growing up, and everybody knew he drank a lot, and it's not something that he could very easily just decide to stop. And ever since he joined the church, it seemed like after he jumped upon the scene, the pastor talked about how bad it is to drink alcohol quite a bit all of a sudden. And whenever that guy finally left, that's when it seemed to calm down, with him hammering away at alcohol all the time. And it's not because suddenly the Bible had a lot more verses about alcohol in it. It's because the pastor knew that that guy was doing something that he didn't agree with and that he believed the Bible commanded against, which it doesn't. But I'll talk about that in a second so I don't get off on a tangent. Basically, the pastor was beating that guy over the head with the Bible. And the whole congregation did it too. They would always try to pray with him and always tell him that we're praying for you, that you'll be able to get past this iniquity and all that sort of shit. If you are in a church congregation, you who are watching this video are in a church congregation, and the people that are in your congregation do not condescend to you, do not look down their long banana nose at your unholy ass, and do not view you as being lesser than they are, then either you have experienced a miracle because you found people who do not follow the natural human instinct of prey upon the weak, and you should be extremely grateful for that and spend as much time with that congregation as you can, or you are unable to see the problem because you're part of the problem. There are no other two ways about it. Either the church is full of assholes who believe that everybody's going to hell except them, or you just got struck by lightning and God especially gave you a fantastic situation. And more often than not, you didn't get struck by lightning. Because it's just the way Christians are in a lot of cases. At least that's the millennial perspective of it. I think I speak for a lot of people my age who are entertaining the idea that there is a intelligent designer of the universe and a God who rules over the laws of physics and clams and doorknobs and all that sort of thing. There's not a whole lot of joy to be had from spending time sitting on a cold pew every Sunday, surrounded by people who are giving you the side eye. I had to deal with that shit for almost 2 decades. And it wasn't just one church that I sat in. It was about 7 or 8. Everywhere I went, it was always the same. Everybody was condescending. And I tried to give each individual church a chance to be nice. I didn't go in there with the preconceived notion that they were all going to hate me. But, I mean, whenever you walk into a building and people look at how you're dressed and judge you because you're not dressing your Sunday best, you've got blue jeans on, because as you know, the Bible says that you have to wear a suit and tie, because that's a thing that was worn in biblical times. You kind of get the picture that Christians are just judgmental as they can be. And they're a group of people that are supposed to be the least judgmental out of everybody, because God specifically says not to judge each other. Over and over again in the Bible, he says that you're not the judge. God's the judge. You're just supposed to be bros, and you're supposed to love God and love others, and that's your only office and your only responsibility. And you don't need to be prideful because you're following all God's commandments, and this rabble that's just walked in our front door and disgraced us with their presence is nobody and nothing. And God will surely allow me into heaven and close the door a little quicker whenever they're coming up behind me. Do I sound bitter? There's a lot of people that I really looked up to in churches. Some people that I really valued. God, so misplaced. I don't want to talk about it much more, so I'm going to go ahead and start concluding the video. Relationships are extremely important to God and extremely important in the Bible. And it's something that the two very obvious rules of the Bible are intended to protect. Love God, protect your relationship with Him. Love others, because those relationships are also very important. But there's also some verses in the Bible that are problematic in today's society. And although I said I was going to keep my opinion to myself, I definitely think that there are some things that people put value on. They're just not that important. And from a millennial's perspective, I would say that, don't pick my pocket, don't break my leg, don't fuck with me. Because how I choose to worship and how I choose to love others is my business. It's God's business, and we'll deal with it together. And it's no damn business of yours.